The morning had begun like any other at the small-town police station. It was the kind of quiet that lulled officers into routine, phones ringing occasionally, the hum of the old coffee machine in the corner, and the shuffle of paperwork echoing, louder than it should. Officer Daniels leaned back in his chair, sipping his second cup of black coffee, while Officer Ramirez cracked jokes to cut through the monotony. Outside, the September air was crisp, and the streets were unusually empty, giving the sense of a day destined to pass without incident. But fate rarely announces itself before it changes everything. The glass doors of the station suddenly pushed open with a squeak. At first, nobody looked up, probably just another resident walking in to ask for directions or report a lost item. Yet what stepped inside wasn't a person at all. A small, scruffy puppy padded across the tiled floor, its paws leaving faint smudges of dirt in its wake. The officers blinked in surprise. Coffee cups paused mid-air. We got ourselves a new recruit?" Ramirez muttered, eyebrows raised. The puppy's fur was matted with mud and tangled into little knots, its ribs faintly visible through the thin coat. It looked no more than a few months old, but its eyes, big, dark, and glistening, were far older than its body suggested. Those eyes darted around the room nervously, then locked on to the first officer, who made direct eye contact. "Where'd you come from, little guy?" Daniels asked softly, crouching low. Instead of shying away like most strays, the pup let out a sharp, almost urgent whimper. Its tiny claws scraped against the tile as it moved closer. Then it barked a high-pitched, frantic sound that carried desperation more than aggression. Before anyone could react, the dog tugged at Daniels's pant leg, gnawing gently as if trying to pull him somewhere. The station filled with chuckles at first. It wasn't uncommon for strays to wander near the station, especially in colder months, hoping for scraps or warmth. But this felt different. The puppy wasn't interested in food or a soft corner to curl up in. Its body trembled with anxiety, and every bark seemed like a plea. "Looks like he's got something to say," Ramirez joked, though the unease in his voice betrayed that he, too, sensed the oddity. The little dog paced in circles, darted to the door, then ran back to Daniels, barking again. Its tail wasn't wagging. It stood stiffly, a sign of tension. The officers exchanged puzzled glances. Dogs didn't usually behave like this unless they were trained, or unless something was terribly wrong. Officer Green, the eldest among them, set down his newspaper and observed quietly. "That's not just a hungry stray," he said finally, his tone serious. "That pup's asking for help." The words hung in the air. Daniels reached out, and the pup, after only a brief hesitation, pressed its tiny head into his palm. It wasn't affection, it was insistence. The dog immediately ran back toward the door and scratched at it, turning its head back as though begging him to follow. For a moment, Daniels hesitated. He had paperwork stacked on his desk, and part of him thought about calling animal control. But then he remembered the look in the puppy's eyes. It wasn't random. This dog hadn't wandered in by chance. Something had driven it here, to this exact place, to these people. He stood slowly. "Get me a leash," he said. Ramirez blinked. "You're serious? It's a stray." Daniels's jaw tightened. "Just get me the leash." The room fell silent as Ramirez rummaged in a cabinet and pulled out an old spare leash left behind from a past canine training. Daniels clipped it gently onto the pup's collarless neck. The instant the metal clasp clicked shut, the dog bolted toward the door, nearly dragging him along. Its strength was surprising for its size, and its determination was undeniable. The other officers rose to their feet, curiosity overpowering routine. A few followed Daniels out of the station, drawn by something they couldn't explain. The air outside was sharp, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt. The puppy didn't pause to sniff the ground like a normal dog. Instead, it ran. With laser focus, darting down the steps and heading straight toward the street. "Hey, where do you think you're taking us?" Daniels muttered, half to himself, as he quickened his pace. The dog barked in response, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed against the empty buildings. Behind them, Ramirez shook his head, though a nervous smile tugged at his lips. "If this pup leads us to a donut shop, I'm filing a complaint." But no one laughed, not really. Deep down, every officer felt it, the strange pull of the moment, the quiet knowledge that they were walking into something far from ordinary. The puppy sprinted ahead, pausing only to glance back and make sure. They were still following. His eyes, glistening with urgency, seemed to plead, "Hurry, time is running out." For reasons none of them could quite explain, the officers obeyed. The station, now emptier than usual, echoed with the memory of tiny paw prints across its tile floor. That morning, none of the men had expected anything more than paperwork, routine calls, and maybe a speeding ticket or two. Yet with every step away from their desks and deeper into the unknown, they felt it a shift in the air. The kind of shift that signals the start of a story no one will ever forget. And at the center of it all was a scruffy, trembling puppy who refused to be ignored. The leash had barely settled around the puppy's neck before it tugged forward with a surprising burst of energy. Officer Daniels stumbled for a moment, caught off guard by the sheer strength of the tiny body. "Easy, boy," he muttered, trying to keep pace, but the puppy refused to slow down. Its claws clicked against the concrete sidewalk as it pulled toward the street, tail stiff, ears perked, its every muscle charged with purpose. Ramirez, watching from the station steps, let out a low whistle. "Would you look at that? It's like he knows where he's going." "He does," Daniels said without hesitation, though he wasn't sure why he believed it. What unsettled him most wasn't the speed or strength of the pup, but the urgency etched into its every movement. Most strays wandered, distracted by every sound, every smell. But this little one didn't pause to sniff trash bins or look for scraps. Its eyes stayed locked ahead, ears twitching only when it barked sharply, almost demanding they follow quicker. The officers followed, half out of curiosity and half because none of them could shake the strange feeling that ignoring the dog would be a mistake. As they walked, townsfolk began to notice. An older woman carrying groceries paused and smiled. Faintly. Well, isn't that a sight? Police walking a puppy through town. But the dog wasn't strolling. It was racing against an invisible clock. Its paws were raw, patches of fur missing, ribs outlined beneath its dirty coat. And yet, despite its weakness, it pressed on with ferocity, barking at every delay. When Daniels tried to tug the leash back gently, the puppy yelped and turned. To him, eyes wide, as if pleading, "Don't stop now. Please, we're running out of time." It shook him. Dogs didn't plead like that, but something in those eyes forced him to relent. All right, Daniels muttered. "Lead the way." The pup darted forward again, weaving between lamp posts, guiding them off the main road and into narrower, less familiar alleys. The officers' boots echoed against damp asphalt as they trailed behind, the sound of dripping water filling the silence. "Doesn't this feel weird to you?" Ramirez asked quietly, his usual humor stripped away. "Everything about this is weird," Daniels admitted. Officer Green, who had tagged along despite his age, kept a steady pace at the rear. His weathered face stayed thoughtful, but his eyes revealed something deeper worry. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know instincts mattered, and his instincts told him this was no ordinary stray. The pup suddenly stopped at a crossroad, panting heavily. Its sides heaved, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Yet it didn't collapse. Instead, It barked again, turning its head rapidly from side to side, as though deciding which path to take. Then, with a sharp whine, it darted left, leash, taut and pulling Daniels hard enough to nearly trip him. They passed graffiti-stained walls, dumpsters buzzing with flies, and the faint stench of rot. Yet the puppy didn't waver. It pulled until its tiny body shook from effort, barking each time the officers lagged behind. Finally, Ramirez broke the silence. "Why do I feel like we're in the middle of some kind of movie?" "Because." "You're not wrong," Daniel said grimly. He wanted to convince himself this was all coincidence, that the pup was simply lost or confused, but his gut told him otherwise. This dog wasn't searching aimlessly. It knew. The strange behavior deepened. At one point, the puppy stopped abruptly and pawed at a drain, whimpering loudly. Daniels knelt, peering inside, but saw nothing but shadows and water. "Nothing here," he muttered. The pup barked furiously, then growled at the drain, teeth bared. Its voice cracked with desperation before it finally gave up and pulled them onward again. Daniels felt a chill. Was the pup pointing out places, or had it simply hoped they'd look closer? The air grew colder as the alleys narrowed. Trash littered the ground, and broken glass crunched beneath their boots. Every few minutes, the dog stopped to bark, paw at something, or whimper before surging forward again. Each display only made the officers more uneasy. At one stop, the pup placed its tiny body against a chain-link fence, pressing so hard its ribs stood out. Its cries were sharp, pitiful. Daniels had to scoop it into his arms to calm it down. He felt its heart hammering against his chest, beating wildly, far too fast for comfort. "You're gonna hurt yourself, little guy," he whispered. But the moment he set it down, the pup lunged forward again. It was relentless. By now, the officers were no longer amused. They weren't even curious. They were worried. What if this isn't random? Ramirez finally said aloud what everyone had been thinking. What if he's leading us to something? Green's voice was low and steady. "He is, and we better be ready when we get there." Daniels didn't respond, but his grip on the leash tightened. The strange behavior continued for nearly 20 minutes, each moment filled with an odd mixture of tension and dread. Every time the dog barked, it pierced their nerves. Every whimper tugged at something deep inside them. And every desperate glance back over its shoulder was another reminder. This wasn't just a stray puppy. It was a messenger. When they finally emerged from the alleys and into a forgotten stretch of town where the buildings stood abandoned, and the air smelled of mildew, the pup slowed. It wasn't from exhaustion, though its body shook with fatigue. It was because they were close. Its eyes dull with weariness, yet fierce with determination, locked onto a collapsed fence ahead. It let out a sound none of the officers had ever heard from a dog before, a mixture between a cry and a bark, as if caught between fear and hope. Then it pulled again, harder than ever, dragging them toward the darkness beyond the fence. And in that moment, each officer realized something chilling. This puppy hadn't wandered into the station by mistake. It had sought them out, chosen them specifically, because it needed help, not for itself, but for something or someone waiting on the other side of that fence. The leash went taut like a whip, and Officer Daniels had no choice but to follow. The puppy darted forward with startling strength, muscles rippling beneath its scruffy coat. Its paws slapped against the cracked asphalt, claws scraping the ground, as if the earth itself might swallow it if it slowed. "Whoa, whoa!" Daniels shouted, half running to keep pace. "You're gonna pull my arm out of the socket." But the little dog didn't care. Its focus was absolute. Its eyes locked ahead as though some invisible thread was pulling it toward destiny. Ramirez jogged alongside, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "This is insane. Look at him go." Even Officer Green, older and slower than the rest, pushed himself harder than usual, unwilling to be left behind. Something in the air urged them all forward, a knowing instinct that told them if they stopped, they might miss the most important thing they'd ever witness. The town around them blurred. They passed storefronts with closed signs swinging lazily in the breeze, alleys stacked with trash bins, and faded murals painted decades ago. The puppy didn't pause, didn't sniff, didn't falter. He ran, like he had been rehearsing this route for days, maybe even weeks, every turn etched into his tiny mind with desperation. Cars slowed as they passed. Pedestrians stopped to stare. A mother tugging her child's hand whispered, "Why are the police chasing a puppy?" But it wasn't the officers chasing him. It was the other way around. A dog was leading, commanding, dragging 3 grown men with the conviction of a general guiding soldiers. Daniel's boots thudded heavily against the pavement. He tried to steady his breathing, but his chest heaved. It wasn't just the physical exertion. It was the rising tide of unease in his gut. "Why do I feel like this isn't going to end?" "Well," he muttered. "Because it won't," Green replied grimly. "Not for a pup this desperate." The words tightened Daniel's throat. He glanced at the dog, who was running so hard his sides heaved violently. Yet he refused to stop. His body was trembling, but his determination burned brighter than his exhaustion. They crossed into an older part of town, where the buildings leaned against one another like weary drunks. Windows were boarded up, paint peeled away in long strips, and weeds broke through every crack in the sidewalk. Few people ever came here anymore. The puppy didn't hesitate. He darted through a rusted gate, the leash snapping taut and nearly yanking Daniels off his feet. "Easy," Daniels shouted, but the pup ignored him. They emerged into an open stretch of road, wider than the alleys but eerily silent. Their footsteps echoed, and the dog's barks reverberated off the hollow walls of abandoned warehouses. It was here that the first test came. The puppy suddenly stopped, tail stiff, ears perked, and let out a bark so sharp it sent shivers up Daniel's spine. Then he whined, circling back toward the officers, tugging furiously at the leash in the opposite direction. "What is it, boy?" Daniels crouched, scanning the shadows. But there was nothing, just silence, and the faint rustle of wind through broken windows. The pup barked again, louder, then pawed at a discarded cardboard box. Daniels flipped. It opened. Nothing. Just soggy paper and trash. The pup growled, teeth bared. He circled the box, then darted toward a drain, whining pitifully. Daniels leaned down again, shining his flashlight into the grate. The beam cut through shallow water. And rust, but no movement stirred. "False alarm?" Ramirez asked, breathless. Daniels shook his head slowly. No. He thought something was here. The pup barked again, frantic, before spinning and surging forward once more. Ramirez cursed under his breath. "This is gonna kill me." But they didn't stop. None of them could not now. The chase continued, the puppy pulling them deeper into forgotten streets. Each turn they took seemed to cut them off from the familiar world. It felt like crossing into another dimension, where time slowed and the air grew heavier. Daniels noticed at first the smell. Damp, musky, tinged with something sour. It clung to the back of his throat, making him swallow hard. The dog smelled it too. His pace quickened, his barks sharper, more insistent. Finally, they reached a stretch where the road narrowed into a dirt path, weeds spilling over its edges. The pup sprinted with the last of his strength, his little body shaking violently with each step. Daniels thought he might collapse, but the dog refused to give in. "Hold on, buddy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he meant it for the dog or himself. They approached a collapsed fence, its wooden boards splintered and gray with rot. The pup slowed at last, panting. So hard his sides seemed ready to split. He barked once, then twice, then let out a sound that froze the officers where they stood a cry. Not a bark, not a whimper, but a heart-wrenching cry of urgency. Daniel's chest tightened. He looked at the others, but they were as shaken as he was. The puppy pawed at the ground, then at the boards of the fence, his nails scraping so hard. They bled. He turned back to Daniels, eyes wide, almost human in their desperation. "Whatever it is," Green said softly, "it's here." For the first time since the chase began, the pup sat down, trembling, exhausted, but with his gaze fixed firmly beyond the fence. He had brought them to this place, and now it was their turn to act. Daniel's hands trembled as he reached for the boards. His heart pounded in his ears. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew with certainty it was something that had driven a tiny, starving puppy to run miles for help. The silence of the deserted street pressed in around them as the officers prepared to uncover what the little dog had risked everything to reveal. And though none of them could say it aloud, they all knew the truth. This wasn't the end of the chase. It was only the beginning. The broken fence loomed before them, its jagged wooden planks leaning outward as though guarding secrets that should never be uncovered. Time-worn nails jutted out at odd angles, catching faint glimmers of sunlight, while vines crept up the splintered boards, weaving nature's warning into the decay. The puppy, however, had no fear. He pressed his tiny body against the barrier, claws scratching with a ferocity that made the officers wince. His high-pitched whimpers sliced through the silence. Daniels crouched and laid a steadying hand on the pup's back. The fur was coarse, cold, and wet with sweat. Beneath it, the ribs trembled from exertion. "You've led us this far, buddy," Daniels whispered. "Let's see what you're trying to show us." Ramirez bent down, gripping one of the rotted boards. It crumbled in his hands, releasing a puff of dust and mildew. The air behind the fence was heavy thick, with the scent of damp wood, rust, and something else. Something sour, metallic. It lodged in their throats and refused to be swallowed. The puppy barked sharply, startling all three officers. He turned his head toward the gap that Ramirez had cleared and pushed his snout through, whining urgently. Green exchanged a grim look with Daniels. "Whatever it is, it's close. Real close." They worked together to clear a space wide, enough to crawl through. Each board groaned in protest, as though the place itself wanted to keep its secret. When at last the gap was wide enough, the pup darted in first, slipping through effortlessly, tail stiff and body low. His barks echoed once, twice, then fell silent. "Wait," Daniels hissed, but the dog had already vanished into the shadowed lot beyond. With a resigned sigh, Daniels ducked low and stepped through the gap. His boots sank into damp earth, patches of moss squelching underfoot. The air was colder here, cut off from sunlight by the looming shells of abandoned buildings. Shards of glass glinted faintly from the ground, catching the light in jagged flashes. The lot stretched wide, but felt suffocating, every corner swallowed in shadow. Crumbling brick walls surrounded them, vines climbing high like skeletal fingers. In the silence, the drip, drip, drip of unseen water echoed, each drop magnified in the stillness. Then came the sound soft, pitiful, like the faintest whimper of a child. Daniels froze. His eyes darted toward the source, but the gloom was heavy, concealing everything. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Ramirez nodded, his face pale. That wasn't just the wind. The puppy barked again, his cry ricocheting between the walls. The sound was raw, urgent, vibrating with desperation. He was close, but unseen. The officers moved forward cautiously, flashlights clicking on one by one. Beams of pale light cut through the murk, illuminating broken crates, rusted pipes, and the remains of a collapsed shed. A puppy appeared suddenly at the base of this rubble, paws frantically digging at a pile of warped boards. His body shook with the effort, wine spilling out of his throat. Every so often, he stopped to glance back at the officers, eyes wide and pleading. Daniels quickened his pace, nearly tripping over a chunk of concrete. He crouched beside the pup, shining his flashlight on the pile. At first, he saw only wood and dirt, but then the light caught movement, a faint twitch beneath the boards. His stomach dropped. Something's under here. Ramirez and Green joined him, both men swallowing hard. The puppy barked so loudly, it made Ramirez flinch. Bennett pawed harder, its claws bleeding as it scraped against the wood. Together, the officers dropped to their knees and began pulling away the debris. The boards were heavy, waterlogged, and riddled with mold. Each piece they removed seemed to breathe life into the silence around them, the air growing thicker with every second. As the pile shrank, the faint whimpers grew clearer. Tiny, fragile sounds that made their chests tighten. Not wind, not echoes, living creatures. When at last a gap opened wide enough, Daniels shone his light inside, and his breath caught. Beneath the rubble, curled together in a pathetic tangle, were several small puppies. Their fur was matted, their tiny bodies thin, their ribs protruding with cruel sharpness. Some twitched weakly at the light, while others remained still too, exhausted to move. The officers froze, their minds struggling to process the sight. The little stray who had led them here shoved his nose into the opening, whining frantically. He licked the nearest sibling through the gap, nudging it with his snout as if urging it to rise. But the smaller pup only whimpered faintly, eyelids fluttering before sinking back into stillness. Daniel's throat constricted. He reached in carefully, hands trembling, and pulled out the first puppy. It was limp in his grip, but he felt the faintest flutter of breath against his palm. Relief flooded him, chased swiftly by fear. "There's more," Green said, voice cracking as he leaned in to grab another. The officers worked silently, urgently, lifting one fragile body after another from the makeshift tomb. Some stirred weakly, tails twitching. Others lay frighteningly still, their breaths shallow, almost imperceptible. The little guide barked furiously, circling the pile, as if making sure no one was left behind. His loyalty was overwhelming. His mission had not been for himself, it had been for them. The lot grew heavy with emotion. The officers' uniforms, usually symbols of authority and strength, were streaked with dirt and sweat as they cradled the tiny lives in their arms. None of them spoke for a long moment. They didn't need to. The scene spoke louder than any words could. Daniels finally broke the silence, his voice thick. "This is what he came for. He brought us here to save them." Green nodded, eyes glistening in the beam of his flashlight. And if he hadn't, they'd have died here alone. The truth settled over them like a weight. The stray had walked into the station, not out of hunger, not for warmth, but with a desperate plea. For help. He had risked everything, his safety, his strength, to bring them here. As the officers gathered the fragile pups, the little dog finally collapsed beside them, his chest heaving, eyes drooping with exhaustion. Yet even then, he wagged his tail faintly, his gaze fixed on his rescued siblings. The trail had led them here into darkness, but within that darkness, they had uncovered something: pure love, loyalty, and a bond strong enough to shatter walls. And though the night pressed heavy around them, none of the officers could deny the truth. They had just witnessed an act of courage that no human could ever match. The silence in the abandoned lot seemed to throb, broken only by the weak whimpers of the rescued puppies. The officers knelt in the dirt, their hands trembling as they held the fragile bodies close to their chests. Flashlight beams wavered, casting jagged shadows across the crumbling walls, while the air carried the pungent smell of mildew, rust, and despair. For men who faced gunfire, high-speed chases, and endless nights of violence, the sight before them was harder to stomach than any criminal encounter. Life was fading in their arms, not from bullets or blades, but from neglect. Daniels cradled the smallest pup, a tiny brown and white one, whose ribs were sharp as blades against his palm. Its breaths came shallow and erratic, each rise of its chest a miracle and a heartbreak all at once. He felt the weak flutter of its heartbeat, so faint he feared it might vanish altogether. "Hold on, little one," Daniels murmured, his voice breaking. He wasn't speaking as an officer anymore. He was speaking as a man, as someone powerless in the face of suffering he could barely comprehend. Nearby, Green crouched with two puppies in his arms, his usually stoic expression fractured into something raw. He rubbed the back of one with gentle circles, as if willing strength into its body. "They're barely hanging on," he whispered. "God, who could leave them like this?" Ramirez scanned the lot with a hardened glare, jaw clenched. He was the kind of man who could channel grief into fury, and his mind had already leapt. "Ahead, this didn't happen by accident," he said bitterly. "Someone put them here. Someone left them to die." The words hung heavy in the cold night air, wrapping around them like chains. The truth was undeniable. The litter hadn't been lost or overlooked. They had been discarded. At that moment, the little stray, the one who had led them through the streets, through the fence, and into this hidden grave staggered to his paws. His legs shook beneath him, his breaths ragged, but he pressed forward, nudging each of his siblings with a trembling snout, licking their tiny faces as though counting them. His determination outshone his exhaustion. He wasn't checking for himself. He was checking for them. Daniels felt his throat constrict. "He knew," he whispered. "This whole time, he knew where they were. He came to us for them, not for himself." The officers fell silent, watching the little survivor stumble from pup to pup, his tail wagging faintly despite his body's frailty. He pressed against Green's knee, whined, then turned toward the pile of rubble again, pawing weakly at the dirt, as though asking them to look deeper. "Is there more?" Ramirez muttered, grabbing his flashlight. He aimed the beam into the shadows of the collapsed wood and brick. For a moment, all was still. Then the light revealed something that froze his blood. A small body, motionless, half buried under the wreckage. "No," Daniels breathed, already pushing forward. His hands tore through debris, nails splintering against sharp wood. He pulled the form free, a tiny pup, but colder than the rest, its body limp. He pressed two fingers to its chest, searching desperately for breath, for heartbeat, for any sign of life. Nothing. The world seemed to stop. Daniels held the lifeless pup against him, his head bowing low. The flashlight beam caught the shimmer of tears sliding down his face. "We were too late for this one." The little stray whimpered, the sound sharper than any scream. He pawed at the still body, nudged it, licked it, but no response came. His tail lowered, his ears flattened, and for the first time, he let out a mournful howl that pierced straight into the officers' hearts. Green wiped at his face roughly, as if ashamed of the tears streaming down his cheeks. This isn't just cruelty. It's evil." Ramirez clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Whoever did this will answer for it," he said through gritted teeth. But the words didn't carry victory. They carried fury born from helplessness. Justice could come later. Right now, life was slipping through their hands. The surviving pups whimpered, their cries soft and weak, barely audible. Each sound was a plea for warmth, for food, for a chance. Daniel stood, holding the smallest one against his chest, its heartbeat faint but present. We need to move, now. Every second counts. Green gathered the two in his arms, tucking them against his jacket for warmth. Ramirez carefully scooped up the rest, his stern face crumbling as tiny whines vibrated against his chest. The little stray followed close, refusing to leave, his weary body staggering yet unyielding. Together, they made their way out of the abandoned lot, flashlights bouncing as they hurried through the night. The cold wind stung their faces, but they hardly noticed. Their thoughts were consumed by the fragile lives pressed against their uniforms. As they crossed back through the broken fence, Daniels glanced at the little stray, who limped beside him with determined steps. "You're their hero," he whispered. The pup looked up, eyes glistening in the dim light, and wagged his tail, faintly as if understanding. By the time they reached the patrol car, the reality of the situation weighed heavier than their gear belts. Daniels quickly opened the back door, spreading his jacket across the seat to lay the smallest ones down. Green grabbed a spare blanket from the trunk, wrapping it tightly around the shivering bodies. Ramirez slid into the driver's seat, voice tight. "Animal hospital. 10 minutes out. Hold them steady." The car roared to life, tires crunching against gravel as they sped into the night. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The officers whispered soft words of encouragement to the puppies, as though speaking could keep them tethered to life. Daniel stroked the tiny head of the pup in his arms, whispering, "Stay with me. You've made it this far. Don't give up now." Beside him, Green rubbed the little survivor, the one who had brought them here. His eyes burned with tears as he whispered, "You saved them. Don't you dare leave us now." The stray's eyes fluttered, his breath shallow, but his spirit remained unbroken. Even in his exhaustion, he pressed his body against his siblings, lending them what warmth and comfort he had left. The drive stretched like eternity, every red light a torment, every second another battle against fate. But at last, the glowing sign of the emergency veterinary clinic appeared ahead, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. They weren't out of danger. Not yet, but they had made it this far, and for the officers, that meant everything. As Ramirez pulled into the lot and screeched to a halt, Daniels looked down at the bundle in his arms. The tiny heartbeat was still there, weak, but fighting. And in that moment, he swore silently that no matter what it took, they would not let these little lives fade away. Not while they still had breath left in their bodies. The emergency veterinary clinic's glass doors slid open with a hiss, spilling a rush of sterile air and fluorescent light into the night. Daniels, Green, and Ramirez rushed inside, their arms full of trembling, fragile bundles. The little stray trailed behind, his paws dragging across the tile floor, but his determination never faltered. The receptionist took one look at the scene and bolted upright. "We need help in here," she shouted, her voice slicing through the quiet lobby. Within seconds, a team of veterinary technicians stormed forward, gurneys and blankets in hand. "What happened?" a young vet demanded as she reached for one of the shivering pups. "They were abandoned," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "Starving, weak, barely hanging on. Please do whatever you can." There was no hesitation. The staff whisked the puppies from their arms, laying them gently on heated pads, inserting 4 lines with practiced precision. The smallest ones were carried into a back room, where machines hummed and monitors beeped. The officers followed, though. They kept to the edges of the chaos, their hearts pounding as though they themselves were patients under examination. The little stray sat at Daniel's feet, panting, his wide eyes locked on the flurry of movement. Every time a technician passed, he perked up, tail wagging weakly, as though begging them to save his family. Green crouched beside him, rubbing the pup's head. "You've done your part," he murmured. "Now it's up to them." The room smelled sharply of antiseptic and fur. The air buzzed with clipped voices, medical jargon, the soft pings of heart monitors. Time seemed to warp. Seconds felt like hours. Each beep of a machine either lifted their spirits or crushed them deeper. One of the vets, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and eyes sharpened by years of battle with life and death, approached them. She held her gloves in one hand, her expression grave. "They're in critical condition," she said quietly. "Severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from hypothermia. 2 are responding to fluids, but the smallest?" She hesitated, glancing toward the incubator, where Daniel's pup lay motionless under a heat lamp. "The smallest is barely holding on." Daniels felt his stomach drop. He had expected the words, but hearing them out loud was a different kind of pain. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. "He's a fighter," he whispered fiercely. "They all are." The vet gave him a sad, knowing smile. "Then we'll fight with them." Hours crawled by in a haze of exhaustion and worry. The officers remained in the waiting area, but none of them sat still. They paced the sterile floor, leaned against the walls, muttered quiet prayers under their breath. Pistray refused to rest, pacing restlessly between the doors and the chairs, whining every time he heard a muffled cry from the back rooms. Green eventually scooped him up, despite the dirt and grime caked in his fur, and held him like a child. "You saved them," he whispered again, stroking his head. "If anyone deserves to make it through this night, it's you." Around 3 in the morning, the vet returned. Her scrubs were stained, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, but her expression had softened. "They're stable," she said, and 3 officers exhaled at once, as though they had been holding their breath for hours. "Weak, but stable. The fluids are working. They'll need time, warmth, and nutrition, but they have a chance." Relief surged through the men, so fierce it left them lightheaded. Ramirez wiped at his face quickly, pretending it was just sweat. Daniel sank into a chair, his hands covering his eyes as he let the tears fall silently. But then the vet's face grew somber again. "The smallest one," she paused, weighing her words carefully. "He's fighting, but it's touch and go. We almost lost him twice tonight. I won't lie to you. It's a miracle he's still with us." Daniel stood again, unsteady but resolute. "Can I see him?" The vet hesitated, then nodded. She led him through the swinging doors into the intensive care ward. Machines beeped steadily, casting faint green glows into the dim room. There, inside a small incubator lined with blankets, lay the tiniest pup. Tubes snaked into his fragile body, his chest rising and falling with painful slowness. Daniels leaned close, pressing a hand gently against the glass. "You're not done yet," he whispered. "You've got a family now. Brothers, sisters, and a hero who wouldn't stop until he found you help." As if in response, the pup stirred faintly, a twitch of its paw against the blanket. Daniel's breath caught. "That's it," he murmured. "You keep fighting. We're not leaving you behind." When he returned to the lobby, Green and Ramirez were slumped in chairs, their eyes heavy with fatigue. The stray, however, sat upright, ears perked, as though waiting for news. Daniels crouched beside him, scratching behind his ears. "They're holding on," he said softly. The pup licked his hand in response, tail thumping weakly against the floor. The hours that followed were long but gentler. The crisis had passed, replaced by quiet hope. Staff moved more calmly now, adjusting 4 drips, spooning tiny drops of formula into eager mouths. One by one, the surviving pups began to stir, tiny tails wagging, faint whimpers growing stronger. When Green was finally allowed to hold one again, he nearly broke down. The tiny creature nuzzled into his chest, rooting for warmth, and he pressed his cheek against its soft fur. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice trembling. Ramirez, usually hardened by years on the force, found himself crouched on the floor, letting two of the stronger pups crawl clumsily across his lap. His laughter was quiet, shaky, but real. "I never thought this is what would break me," he admitted. Through it all, the little stray stayed near, watching with unblinking eyes. When the vets finally brought food and water, he ate cautiously, never straying too far from the incubators. His loyalty was unshakable, his devotion absolute. By dawn, the clinic was quiet again. The pups were sleeping in warm blankets, their bellies finally full, their bodies no longer trembling. The officers sat together in the lobby, exhaustion dragging at their limbs, but their hearts lighter than they had been in days. Daniels looked around at his fellow officers, then down at the stray curled against his boots. "We came here to work a shift," he said softly. "Instead, we ended up part of something bigger." Green nodded, eyes still fixed on the puppies sleeping in the back. "They're alive because of him," he said, pointing to the little stray. "That dog walked into our station and asked for help, and we almost didn't understand him." Ramirez exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. "Maybe sometimes it takes an animal to remind us what humanity looks like." Silence settled between them, not heavy this time, but warm. The first rays of morning sun spilled through the clinic's windows, painting the room in gold. The battle wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, and challenges ahead. But for now, in that quiet morning light, all that mattered was that the tiny family had been given a chance. And the little stray, the hero, who refused to give up, finally closed his eyes and slept, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to save. The sun rose slowly over the small town, spilling pale light through the clinic's windows. Inside, the officers stirred from their restless seats, exhaustion etched into their faces. The pups were alive, fragile, clinging to life but alive. That victory was enough to carry them through the night. Yet beneath the relief simmered something darker. "Someone put them there," Ramirez said, breaking the silence. His voice was gravelly from lack of sleep. "Dogs don't pile themselves under boards in an abandoned lot. Someone did that to them." Daniels rubbed a hand across his tired face, staring at the floor. "I keep thinking about it. Whoever left them knew they wouldn't survive. That wasn't neglect, it was intent." Green leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His eyes had softened while watching the pups recover, but now they hardened again. "We can't just walk away. That lot was a dumping ground. If they did it once, they'll do it again." The little stray, curled at their feet, lifted his head at the sound of their voices. His ears twitched, and his tired eyes blinked slowly, as if he understood their resolve. He nudged Daniel's boot with his nose, a faint whine escaping his throat. Daniels reached down to scratch behind his ears. "Don't worry, boy. We'll find out who did this." Later that morning, after ensuring the pups were stable in the care of the veterinary team, the three officers climbed back into their patrol car. The world outside seemed brighter, almost mocking in its normalcy. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing. Shops opened their doors. Life went on, oblivious to the cruelty uncovered just a few streets away. Ramirez drove, his jaw clenched, while Daniel sat in the passenger seat, scanning the notes he'd jotted down the night before. Green, in the back seat with the little stray curled beside him, watched the city roll by. Their first stop was the abandoned lot. In daylight, it looked even worse. The broken fence leaned at odd angles, the rubble scattered like bones. A faint stench still clung to the air, sour and heavy, seeping from the woodpile where the pups had been trapped. Daniels crouched low, examining the ground. "Fresh prints," he muttered, pointing to faint tracks in the dirt. "Boots, more than one pair. Someone's been here recently." Green scanned the perimeter. Could be teenagers. Could be squatters. But the way those pups were hidden, It feels deliberate. Ramirez approached the collapsed structure, shining his flashlight into dark corners even though the sun was out. There's trash here. Food wrappers, cigarette butts. Someone's been using this place. He bagged a half-burned pack of cigarettes, his motions brisk, professional. But his eyes betrayed the fury smoldering inside him. The stray sniffed the ground intently, his nose darting across the dirt, tail stiff. Suddenly, he barked sharply and ran to the far corner of the lot. There, buried beneath weeds, lay a rusted dog crate. The metal bars were bent and jagged, but inside were tufts of matted fur. Daniel's breath hitched. They were caged. Green's face darkened. This wasn't just someone discarding strays. This was deliberate cruelty. Ramirez pulled on gloves and lifted the crate carefully, noting the filth encrusted on its base. We'll run it for prints, DNA, whatever we can get. The stray circled the crate, barking furiously, then pressed his nose against the bars. With a mournful whine, his body trembled, his chest heaving. It was as if the sight had dragged him back into a nightmare. Daniels knelt, wrapping an arm around him. It's okay. You got them out. They're safe now. But even as he said it, the weight of the discovery pressed harder on his shoulders. Back at the station, the evidence was processed. Photographs of the lot, the rubble, the crate. Samples taken from the ground. Every detail was logged, but the weight of it wasn't just in paperwork. It clung to them like a second skin. Word of the discovery spread quickly among the department. Some officers shook their heads, muttering curses under their breath. Others simply sat in silence, their expressions grim. It wasn't just a case. Anymore, it was personal. By afternoon, leads began to trickle in. Reports of stray dogs seen near the lot. Neighbors recalling a group of young men who had loitered in the area weeks before, carrying cages in the dead of night. Whispers of backyard breeding operations and abandoned litters. Ramirez pounded a fist against the desk. We're not chasing rumors. We need something solid. Green leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed in thought. We start with the crate. Manufacturing code, distributor. Someone bought it, maybe recently. Daniels nodded, his gaze drifting to the stray, lying at his feet. The pup had barely moved since returning to the station, exhausted from days of hunger and the ordeal of leading them to his siblings. Yet his presence was a reminder of what was at stake. Whoever did this isn't just cruel, Danielle said quietly. They're dangerous. And they'll do it again, unless we stop them. That evening, the officers returned to the clinic. The pups were stronger now, their cries louder, their movements less sluggish. One even wagged its tail when Green leaned down to stroke its head. The vet smiled faintly. They've got a long road ahead, but they're fighters. Thanks to you and thanks to him. She nodded toward the stray, who was watching the reunion from the doorway. Daniels crouched beside him. Hear that, buddy? You're the hero of the story. The pup licked his hand, eyes shining. But as the officers stood among the cages, listening to the fragile sounds of life returning, the weight of unfinished business settled over them. The puppies were safe for now, but justice had not been served. Ramirez's voice was steady but low, meant only for his partners. Tomorrow, we start knocking on doors. Someone out there thought these lives didn't matter. We're going to prove them wrong. The stray pressed closer to Daniel's leg, as if agreeing. And in that moment, the officers made a silent vow, not just as men of the law, but as human beings bound by compassion. They would not stop until the truth was dragged into the light, no matter how dark the trail became. The following morning dawned gray, a heavy sky pressing down over the station. But inside, the atmosphere carried a different kind of weight, a steady determination. The case had ceased to be just another line on a report. For Daniels, Ramirez, and Green, it was personal. They had seen suffering no living thing should endure. They had carried it in their arms, felt it shiver against their uniforms, and watched it fight for survival under sterile hospital lights. And at their feet, curled quietly, was the little stray, their unlikely partner in this case, their compass pointing toward justice. Detective work in animal cruelty cases often moved slowly, tangled in bureaucracy and short on resources. But this case had momentum. The crate from the abandoned lot yielded fingerprints, smeared but traceable. One belonged to a man with a prior record. Illegal breeding, animal neglect, fines left unpaid. His name surfaced quickly: Earl Watson. Watson's address was a rundown property on the edge of town. Neighbors had complained for months about barking, strange odors, and late-night activity. Complaints that, like so many, had been filed away without follow-up. Now, those reports took on new meaning. By noon, the officers had a warrant in hand. The property was worse than they imagined. A chain-link fence sagged under its own rust, and the yard was littered with broken furniture and car parts. The smell hit first, a rancid cocktail of waste and rot. Behind the house, rows of cages lined the dirt, each holding dogs in various states of neglect. Some barked weakly, others lay silent, too exhausted to move. Green swore under his breath. This is it. Daniel's chest tightened, fury burning hot beneath his ribs. But they moved carefully, professionally, announcing themselves as they breached the yard. Watson stumbled out of the back door, cigarette dangling from his lips. His expression bored until he saw the uniforms. "What the hell do you want?" Ramirez's voice was ice. "You're under arrest for animal cruelty, neglect, and illegal breeding operations." The man sneered, but his defiance crumbled as officers swarmed the property. The sight of evidence, malnourished animals, filthy cages, the stench of decay was undeniable. As Watson was led away in cuffs, Daniels lingered by the cages. Dogs pressed their noses through the bars, eyes pleading. His throat ached. They would all need care, medical attention, and homes. But at least, starting today, they had a chance. News of the bust spread quickly through the community. Headlines called the stray a hero, the dog who walked into a police station and changed everything. Donations poured in for the clinic caring for the rescued pups. Volunteers lined up to help, some even offering foster homes. The little stray, though, remained at the officer's side. He followed Daniels from station to clinic to station, as though afraid to let his newfound protectors out of sight. Each day, he grew a little stronger, his fur shinier, his steps steadier. But his devotion never wavered. At the clinic, the rescued litter continued to fight. The smallest pup, the one Daniels had feared losing, was slowly gaining weight. Its breaths grew steadier, its cries louder. The vet called him a miracle. Daniels called him a warrior. Green often visited, sitting cross-legged on the floor while the puppies tumbled clumsily across his lap. Ramirez, for all his hardened edges, was caught more than once slipping treats to the little heroes when he thought no one was looking. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were symbols of resilience, proof that even in the face of cruelty, hope could take root. Weeks later, the case went to court. Watson sat sullen in his chair, his lawyer muttering about strays and property. But when photographs of the lot, the crates, and the malnourished animals were shown, the courtroom shifted. Gasps filled the room, and tears slid down strangers' faces. The most powerful moment came when the little stray himself was brought in, tail wagging nervously as he padded beside Daniels. The judge leaned forward, watching the dog settle calmly at the officer's feet, his eyes bright, his body strong. "This animal," Daniels testified, voice steady though his throat tightened, "walked into our station not to save himself, but to save his family. Without him, none of those puppies would be alive today. That kind of loyalty, that kind of courage, deserves more than our pity. It deserves justice. The gavel fell hard. Watson was sentenced to prison, barred from owning animals for life. It wasn't enough to erase the pain he'd caused, but it was a victory. And in that courtroom, as the little stray rested his head against Daniel's boot, it felt like justice had finally spoken. In the months that followed, the story spread far beyond the town. Newspapers dubbed the stray Guardian. Children drew pictures of him in school. Families visited the shelter, asking specifically for one of Guardian's puppies. But for Daniels, Green, and Ramirez, the most important part was quieter. It was the mornings spent visiting the clinic, watching the pups grow strong enough to play. It was the evenings when Guardian, no longer a stray, but a part of their lives, curled at their feet as paperwork piled high. One spring afternoon, as the puppies tumbled through the grass in a foster yard, Daniels crouched beside Guardian. "You saved them," he murmured, "and you saved us too. You reminded us why we wear this badge in the first place." Guardian wagged his tail, leaning into Daniel's chest with a sigh. His work was done. Weeks later, adoption day came. Families filled the shelter, hearts open, arms ready. One by one, the puppies went home to children who squealed with joy, to couples who had waited years, to households where love overflowed. Each new beginning felt like a victory, a promise that cruelty could never eclipse kindness. The smallest pup, the Miracle, was the last to leave. Daniels handed him to a young girl, who cradled him gently, whispering promises of bedtime snuggles and backyard adventures. Daniel's eyes stung, but his heart felt light. Guardian stayed, of course. He wasn't going anywhere. The officers had already made the decision long ago, though no one had said it out loud. He had chosen them, and they had chosen him. Guardian became their station's unofficial mascot, his picture framed on the wall, his presence a reminder of courage and compassion. And every time a new recruit walked through those doors, Guardian was there to greet them, tail wagging, eyes bright as if to say, "Never forget why you're here." That night, as Daniels locked up and stepped into the cool air, Guardian padded. Beside him, head held high. The stars stretched wide above, silent witnesses to a journey that had begun with a desperate bark and a plea for help. Daniels glanced down at the dog and smiled. "Not just a stray anymore," he whispered. "Your family." And in the quiet of the night, with the weight of justice behind them and hope stretched out ahead, Guardian wagged his tail and walked into his new life, no longer alone, but forever loved.